July 12, 1994. Barbara Fisher Pratt recording some of the information about the origin of the Fisher family for the Schaeffers. I will try to give you some of the background, some of the anecdotes. Eventually, I hope to give you the chart. I won't have that ready for the reunion time. But here, Yulee was important from the Stone Age right on through to the Industrial Revolution. In the Cotswold, they grew a local brand of sheep, which produced a great deal of fleece. According to the statistics, 28 pounds of fleece per sheep. The rivers and the steep valleys, it is on the banks of the Severn River, which flows into the Bristol Channel. And the river and the steep valleys provided power, mills, and large deposits of fuller earth used to clean the wool. That fulfilled the basic need of cloth making. This really was the importance of Yulee. And it started really way back at the time of Edward the Confessor in 1042. Edward the Confessor began to realize how the lowlands, the Netherlands, were gaining profit from their English wool. The fleece was English, and the fleece was being sent to Europe, where it was woven and manufactured into cloth, and of course the gold became Europe's. So he decided that he would offer to Flemish weavers land to bring them to England to start a woolen industry. And in a few years, the Cotswolds began to produce more than half of the cloth of the European community. Every other worker in the area was involved, and the area had over 500,000 sheep. Go to the Cotswolds, you will notice the wool markets in Tetbury and Chipping Camden. I'm sure some of you have already seen those or seen pictures of them. It was the most important industry in Britain, and it grew and it grew and it grew from those early years after Edward the Confessor got the production taken back to England. The merchants became very rich. Their chief method of spending after giving money to the king was the endowment of churches, wool churches they are called, and they're in all of those little villages. Wonderful inscriptions over some of the doors, such as, "I praise God and ever shall. It is the sheep that have paid for it all." The government, too, was well aware, because the Lord Chancellor, even today, sits on a wool sack in the House of Lords. This trade lasted for very many centuries, until the invention of the mechanical power loom, which brought about the Industrial Revolution. This was invented by a man named Cartwright, and your great-grandfather Henry mentions a visit to a museum where his power loom is displayed on his visit back to England when he and Martha Ann went for their 25th wedding anniversary in 1906. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about that later, because that diary has helped me to tie up a good many ends where I can almost track their peregrinations, their traveling, to try to find work. Going back, your great-great-grandfather was named George Fisher, born of Mary in 1820. He was the illegitimate son of Mary. Mary we can track back to 1792, who was married to a John, I think. But further back I cannot. Maybe the office in Gloucestershire can do a little bit more. I don't know. I may do so. Your great-great-great was Anne Hancock. She is the daughter of Phoebe Hancock of the Street. Now, the Street sounds pretty bad, but it doesn't mean what it sounds, because there is the main street in Yulee is called the Street, and it's the main drag. There are a few branches off of it, but that is the address, the street. Her father is listed as Thomas Ford, Ford family remains, in my mind, as a real relationship, because I can remember my father and Aunt Annie talking about the Fords, and as I went through Grandpa's diary, or my grandpa's diary, or great-grandpa's diary, I have found several references to visiting with Mother Ford. So I have a feeling that the Ford became grandparents of Anne and George, since it is mentioned so many times in the diary. Anne and George lived in this little village, and I'm sure they worked very hard because Yulee was going through a tremendous change as the Industrial Revolution was coming along. In the late 1700s, about 1785 or so, there was the invention of the mechanical loom by a Mr. Cartwright, Edmund Cartwright. And this had a tremendous bearing on the roots of our Fisher family, because Yulee was on the downgrade, as were all those Cotswold villages. No longer were the rivers needed. Everything could be done by power. And in fact, they did try to bring some power into Yulee. Competition was too great in the Midlands, so it was impossible for them to carry on their trade as they had always done. I want to go back and give you a kind of descriptive thing, a few things about the early working period in Yulee, because it doesn't sound as though it was a very good life. It sounds like terribly hard work and very dismal, despite the fact that the town itself is one of the most beautiful towns I've ever seen in England. It is frozen in time because from the early 1800s until the end of the First World War, it went into a decline, and the population dropped to 1,000 people. There was terrible poverty. There was put up because there was such starvation that everybody was trying to help these poor people. So I rather think that our grandparents were caught in the devastation that they had to get out of. So what happened? They moved north. They went up where the work was. It's interesting to note how they must have traveled by wagon. It was been a very, very hard trip. But they obviously moved up into the Midlands because I have the birth of Henry, and I do have the birth certificate as of October the 15th, 1851, in the town of Derby. Jim and I found the street. It's called John Street, and it was council housing for poor people. It's interesting to see what Britain has done to take care of poor people. George is listed as a blacksmith. When the census was taken in March of 1851, in this I have the figures listed: William Fisher, the first child, born in 1842 in Yulee, and a daughter, Mary, born July 6th in 1849 in Yulee. So obviously they moved from Yulee sometime after 1849, between 1849 and 1851, because Henry was born in Derby on October 15, 1851. Anne must have been pregnant in March 50 when the census was taken. Subsequently, they had several other children. Nathaniel, I think, is in some way tied up with the Windsor family in Greenville, and I will check that out in time because Louise Windsor's husband is doing a genealogy study too, and I think I can track him down. Then there was Joseph, and there was Thomas, and there was Elizabeth. In all, 7 children, which is pretty common for these generations. Of course, they had no birth control, and everybody produced large families, so that was not unusual. One interesting fact to note, when Jim and I were in Yulee, we ran into a Colin Fisher. As a matter of fact, we tracked down as many Fishers as we could. And fortunately, we had a good deal of help from the proprietress of our little B&B where we stayed, because she was native and she was very proud of this little village. With good reason. It's frozen in time because there was sun until after the First World War. And in fact, there isn't much going on even now. And it is a kind of valley with beautiful green hills, a great deal of stonework. The houses are all stone. It's soft. It's gentle. I'm sure the work wasn't, but it was a beautiful place to live, that's for certain. Anyway, as we walked around the streets and called on the various Fisher families, we eventually ran into one whose name was Colin Fisher. I rather think that he is a blood relative. He looks very much like the Fishers, and we're tracking that down. I'm sure there's a connection, but I want proof, and I'm waiting for word from the Gloucestershire office, archival office. They've been very good to help me. Anyway, as we talked with Colin, he said, "Now wait a minute, let me call Aunt Nellie." Aunt Nellie was something like 86 years old. This was several years ago. And when he called Aunt Nellie, she said, "Oh, of course. George and Anne went to America." That, to me, was pretty solid proof of the Fisher roots. And to clinch it a little more, let me read to you an article that was pinned in the Bible of George and Anne Fisher sometime around 1891 on the occasion of George Fisher's 70th birthday. He died at 73 in 1894, so I'm guessing this was around 1891. The children and immediate family of Mr. George Fisher, an old and valued employee of the Heat and Button Fastener Company, paid a surprise visit to his house, 107 Carey Street, last evening on the anniversary of his 70th birthday. During the evening, he was presented an easy chair and other tokens of love. Singing, readings, and instrumental music by grandson Charlie Fisher made a delightful entertainment. A poem composed by William Fisher, the eldest son, was read, and it's a pleasant feature of the reunion. Mr. Fisher is hale and hearty and bids fair to attend a ripe old age. This clinches to me the fact that William was the first son, because we have that all the way through the records. And we do know that Henry brought his family to the United States. So now we'll get into the next generation of Henry, born in 1851, married to Martha Ann Bullivant in 1881. My memories of Grandpa Fisher are very few. We and I, your mother and I, were 9 years old when Grandpa died. Of course, we were there for the funeral because all the families gathered. The funeral was held at 587 Academy Avenue, the family home. In those days, of course, the body was laid out in the parlor. And my recollection of that day is one of being scared. I remember Helen and I kept avoiding going into the parlor by running around the wonderful big porch, one of those wraparound porches that those Victorian homes had. And it was not a very happy recollection, but I'm sure we were not very happy little girls. And another memory I have comes actually from a snap. We had a number of campers at the old house on Academy Avenue, and there's a series of snapshots of the family taken in the backyard under the pear tree. I think it was a pear tree. And there is one of all of us grandchildren gathered around Grandpa Henry Fisher's rocking chair. That is the sum total of my personal memories of Grandpa Henry Fisher. But we've been very fortunate that somebody was foresighted enough to save a diary that Henry Fisher wrote in 1906 when he and Martha Ann returned to England to celebrate their 25th anniversary. This diary is quite fascinating because it gives us a pretty good picture of Henry Fisher's background and very clear why he became involved with the textile mills. Of course, we know that his parents were weavers and spinners in their early youth, and then when the terrible disaster of the Industrial Revolution made them move from Yule's into the Midlands, where the mechanical loom was taking over, we know that Henry's father became a blacksmith. And it must have been a pretty tough time for all those people, so they moved from place to place. And I've been able to track Henry Fisher's movements somewhat, and I thought you might be interested. We know he was born in Derby. From diary, I learned that this diary entry is May 31st, Thursday, 1906. And this is something of interest because it shows us how hard Grandpa worked from a very young age. Thursday morning, both of us feeling all right. Martha had her breakfast brought to her room, 6 pence extra, while I went to the Midland Hotel and had 2 eggs and so forth. Price, and I can't read that. Called on Mrs. Mother Ford. Now, Mother Ford plays a big part in this diary. He calls on her several times. And Mother Ford must be the grandmother, because we know very well that Hancock's father was Thomas Ford. I went to my old shop where I was 12 years old, saw one of the press, Mr. Needham. He gave me a pound, and I bought half dozen teaspoons as treats for the continent, taking presents. Tickets for the continent, Berlin, Lucerne, Paris, and back to London. 2 tickets, £4, 17 shillings in the Club building. Well, it's a little mixed up, but what happened was he went to his shop, and then he went on to buy his tickets for their planned trip to the continent where they were going to spend their 25th wedding anniversary. From here on, he describes their trips, and I'll just give you briefly. They went from England up, from the Midlands up to London, and enjoyed themselves thoroughly in London with trips to Buckinghamshire and so on. And then they went on a 2 continents, and they hit Switzerland, Paris, Germany, the Rhine journey. It sounded absolutely delightful. Their 25th wedding anniversary was on the 21st of June, and they went on a lovely steamer trip on Lake Lucerne. What a marvelous way to celebrate a 25th wedding anniversary. After doing the continent, they went back to the British Isles by boat and then toured Scotland, which is very, very interesting because he actually writes about the Robert Burn House and going into Glasgow and Edinburgh and so forth. They arrived back in their own home area of the Midlands. Actually, it is here to the natives. The area where Grandpa Henry Fisher came from is West Riding. It includes Leeds and Bradford and Manchester, which of course is the area of the big mills. They went back to Accrington, which seems to be their focal point, and traveled out from there for the rest of the month of July. Actually, they had another week in in England, sailed for home on August the 1st, 1906. This was quite a wonderful trip, and I was thinking about it the other day. You realize this was before the First World War, so there was a lot more to see than one can see today after two wars. Evidently, Henry Fisher loved to travel, because we have another bit of information that he went to California in 1904 and was on Catalina and sent a postcard home to my father, which tells what a wonderful trip that was. So you have always, I guess, had wanderlust in their blood. But to get back to the facts, we don't really have much more direct information, except we know that he did invent a little gadget called the National Ring Traveler, which supposedly helps the threading of the thread through the loom, to the loom. I can't really describe it. I don't really know it. I just know it was a very good invention. And he and Mr. White formed a company called the National Ring Traveler. This was evidently very successful, and we can feel certain that Grandpa made a good deal of money. He couldn't have traveled like this. He couldn't have maintained his home as he did, and he must have had a rather happy life. I do know a few things that would be of interest to you about his own thrust of interest, really. I know that when my father and Uncle Arthur were college age, he offered them a choice of becoming lifetime Masons or to go to college. Well, guess what? We know they became lifetime Masons. Now, to Grandpa, the Masonic order was the most important thing in the world. It pops up in all of his diaries. He always is emphasizing meeting brother Masons, and I can understand it, because this was a guild. You know, and a guild in the early years, late 1700s, 1800s, early 1800s, was a very important badge of success. And actually, the biggest lodge in England is in Birmingham, one of the biggest at least. So I understand this, that he thought this was just as important, if not more so, than going to college. So, of course, Uncle Arthur and Uncle Francis had a wonderful life. They had a car. They were able to be one of the first to drive in the city of Providence, really. And they made a trip to Syracuse to visit Aunt Annie when she was teaching school there, and there's a wonderful newspaper clipping about that. So, to get to your Aunt Annie and Raymond and my father and Arthur Fisher, the three children who carry on the Fisher line, we will move on to their dates and activities, if you will. But I must back up just a minute. I forgot to mention anything much about Martha Ann Fisher, who was Martha Ann Bullivant. I know that Martha Ann Bullivant's parents came from the southern part of England, still around that Gloucestershire area, but off toward the coast more, near Torquay, Babbacombe. We have a prayer book that sets the date and sets the area. Jim and I went there. We went to St. Mary's Parish, where we learned that she had gone to Sunday school as a child, and we tried to get some records, but we were told, a good deal of searching around, that all the records of those early years had been bombed out in the second. I'm still working on it because I think it would be fascinating to get that history, but I'll have to do it through the archival offices in Gloucestershire. Martha Ann actually was born north. She was born in Birmingham, in an area called Aldrich, Staffordshire. And she was born in 1861. From what I've learned, her father was a shoemaker. I know for a fact that she came from the Birmingham area. Her brother Frank was born in 1855 in Warwickshire, which is very close to the Aldrich area. You can see that they did a good deal of moving around, and I'm sure it was to find work, although where the work actually was. Martha Ann must have had a very nice life, but a very short one. She was only 55 years old. She dropped dead on the street coming from babysitting, if you will, for my cousin Helen in August of 1914. Helen was just 2 months younger than I, and I know this is a fact because my mother often told how sad it was that she had gone to help Aunt Annie, who had something to do that night, and on the way home she had a stroke or a heart attack and died before they got her home. And this is a very kind of interesting note because everybody in the family, Aunt Annie and the children, my father, they certainly loved their mother very much, and it must have been a very difficult time to have lost her so early. Of course, they were by that married and out, but still, they didn't have a relationship after they left home. So that was really the story of Martha. And now returning to our own parents, my own parents, Chester's own parents, Henry's own parents, I'll try to give you what information I have. And I'm going to ask you to do me a favor in filling out some forms when you're here for the reunion so that I can get this into the Mormon record, because once it goes into the records, it's preserved. And I think it would be very nice to have it. They've helped me, and I'd be glad to help them. All right? Annie Fisher Siemens was born in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, I don't know the exact date that Henry came to the States. I know that in his diary, he mentions that he returned to the town of Leeds in England after 27 years away. So he was in Leeds in 1879. So Annie, who was born in 1882, was born in Providence, so by that time they were in the United States. Of course, Henry and Martha Ann were married in 1881. Now, whether they were married in the States or whether they were married in England, I have yet to find out. I've searched and searched, and I still have not got that really tight, but I will. Annie Fisher Siemens was the first child of Martha Ann and Henry. Born in Providence in 1882, died in Westerly in 1968. My memories of Aunt Annie are many and wonderful. She was more than aunt to me. She did so many things to help me that I would bore you with enumerating them all. For some reason or other, she decided that I needed to go to college. And she pushed it very hard. I don't think my mother and father cared whether I went or not. I don't think they really wanted me to go. It was expensive. But Aunt Annie had always treated me more than just as a niece. She had given me some lovely Sheffield candlesticks when we were married, and even before that, she gave me a ring that had been Martha Ann Bullivant's ring, and I think I found that Grandpa bought it on that return trip in 1906. I have worn it from the age of 16 to the present. I still have it on. Aunt Annie put me through school, through college. I did go to classical high school, and she knew that I had had enough. She took me to Little Compton to pick out materials. She made all my clothes for my freshman year. She did help with financing it. She just was determined I would go. Now you realize she herself was the class of 1904, or she always called it, and she was very proud and very pleased with Pembroke. She loved it. It was a big part of her life. And I guess she wanted it to share it with me for some reason or other. And we did. We had a good many happy times together with a lot of talk about Brown and about everything that she had gone through and what I was doing that was different. But more than that, more than those memories, which are still very precious to me, she did fill me in a lot about her mother being a seamstress and do very beautiful sewing, so that she had learned from her mother. She also obviously admired her very much and was saddened at early death. She also told me a lot about the English menu, mannerisms, and you know, every Christmas, many Christmases, not every one, but many Christmases, we all went to Aunt Annie's house in Roslindale, Massachusetts, for our Christmas dinner. And it was always a British dinner with roast beef and ending with plum pudding. And for a long time, I made Aunt Annie's plum pudding to give as Christmas presents. I can't bore you with so much of this, but if you want to know and talk about it later, I'll be glad to tell you, because she was a very important person in my life, and I'm ever, ever grateful to her. Aunt Edith and Uncle Arthur were also a very important part of our growing up. That house on Academy Avenue, we spent many, many hours in, churning ice cream in the kitchen for Sunday night suppers, singing around the piano. It was a wonderful time for the family. And they got together. They always got together. And it was a delight. I don't think people do that so much today, and I miss it, which is a change in a way of life, because I don't think families are quite as tightly knit as they were when we were growing up. But I'm sure that one of the influences in my life were those times on Academy Avenue and in Roslindale, and also at Corny, because you do remember we had a good many reunions at Corny. One of my earliest memories of Corny is being a very little girl when my father and my mother and Dick and I went down to the beach in the old cars, and we always changed our clothes in the Budlong farm in the kitchen and went on down the beach to spend the day. What a happy time that was as little kids. I don't know what's happened now. I think the Budlong farm, well, I know it's all changed because I've been there since and seen it. But Henry and Helen and Dick and I had a good many times together at the beach and in Roslindale, and then with Brad and Chet and Aunt Edith and Uncle Arthur. Another wonderful memory is that we always met, or very often met, on Memorial Day in Taunton for the herring run, and then we would drive to Cape Cod and pick our butis, taking a picnic lunch, one of the first visits to the beach at Cape Cod. Sometimes very cold, sometimes not cold at all. But I can remember those vividly. And I think Helen and I had more fun on those picnics than anybody else, because we have pictures of us standing on the rocks and so forth at the beach. It was fun. There are more vivid memories. I remember very well when the most important date in my life, Jim came home from Princeton on April the 1st, before April the 1st, the Easter week of April, from Princeton, and it was decided by my father that we should be married that week rather than wait until June, because my mother was in the hospital with a mental breakdown, and he thought it would be impossible to have a wedding. So, you can believe Aunt Annie and Aunt Edith pitched in like Trojans. And when we were married on April the 2nd, Aunt Edith at the church with a lovely wedding cake from the oven, Aunt Edith had a punch, beautiful reception for all of my friends who had gathered around for the wedding. And then we went up to Boston for the weekend, and what do you think? Your mother and your father, Bill, came to the Copley Plaza to have dinner with us one night while we were there. Can you believe having such a wonderful family rallying around to give you such a lot of pleasure? Well, that's what they did. Aunt Annie was a big influence in my life. Uncle Raymond, too. Uncle Raymond was a fine man. He might have been a little bit brusque and a little brittle, but that's what happens when people are really brilliant, and he was. He was fun. He and Dad and gathered around the table at Christmas and Thanksgiving would also get going on Cockney English and have a great time just joshing around. Uncle Arthur and Aunt Edith. Arthur was born in 1888 in Providence. You know, I really think that Grandpa did a remarkable job of being in England in 1879 and then in the United States bringing his whole family over and building his own family. He was a very busy man, I can see that. Arthur was born in 1888 in Providence, and as you know, he died in Westerly in 1967. He and Edith were also a big part of my childhood, as the whole Fisher family was. My father and Uncle Arthur used to sit on the porch at Corny in rocking chairs in the old log cabin, even at the old beach house years ago, and just talk a mile a minute about bygone days. They had a wonderful time. And Aunt Annie was always there, too, joining in whenever she was free. My dad depended upon the family. His life revolved around the family. I think he would not have survived without them. He wasn't a very responsible man in many ways, but he had a tremendous loyalty to his own family, and that has stuck with me, too. Uncle and Edith, over the years, have helped me as much as Aunt Annie and Uncle Raymond did. When I was a little girl, I ran away from home. And where did I go? I went to Aunt Edith's house. And I can remember being scared. And I must have been very scared. But Aunt Edith took me in and eventually got me back to school, which was very embarrassing because I'd been a runaway. But eventually, she helped me through some very troublesome times as a child. And as I say, we went every Sunday for supper together in the old house, churning ice cream in the kitchen, and Sunday night supper together was just terrific. It was the big part of our life for Dick and for me. And also, Aunt Edith helped Dick through the time when my mother was in the hospital, for Dick went to live with her when I went to live with Jim's family. I don't know what we would have done as children because our family was not in a very good shape. And our two aunts pulled us through a very difficult time. Turn it over, it's becoming loose and not recording very well.